Terrifying. True Halloween stories. Halloween, the one night of the year where the line between fantasy and reality blurs. It's a time for costumes, candy, and creepy thrills. But for some, Halloween becomes a night that changes everything. Here are 3 terrifying, true stories that prove sometimes the scariest things happen when you least expect them. Story 1. The Fake Baby in the Stroller. It was a crisp October evening, and the excitement in the air was palpable. Halloween was Sean's favourite time of the year, and this particular Halloween had him buzzing with anticipation. He, along with his best friend Johnny, had been looking forward to trick-or-treating for weeks. They were old enough to roam the streets alone this year, without their parents trailing behind. It felt like freedom, the thrill of knocking on strangers' doors, the excitement of filling up their bags with candy, and the joy of staying out past dark. This was everything they had dreamed of. Little did they know, the night would unfold in a way they could never have imagined. Their neighborhood was quiet as they began their adventure, the orange glow of jack-o'-lanterns illuminating the darkened sidewalks. The boys laughed, comparing their costumes and collecting candy from every house they visited. The world seemed to melt away with every step they took, the familiar streets now transformed into a spooky, magical place. As the night deepened and the shadows grew longer, the streets became emptier. The once bustling neighborhood was now eerily quiet, with fewer trick-or-treaters around. It was then that they noticed him, a man strolling behind them, pushing a stroller. He was walking slowly, methodically, as though taking his time with each step. The boys glanced at each other, unsure at first. There was something about him that didn't seem right, but it wasn't immediately clear. He wasn't dressed in a costume, but that alone wasn't cause for concern. He was carrying a large brown sack, the kind you'd expect to see at Halloween, clearly filled with candy. "Hey boys," he called out softly, his voice gentle and almost comforting. "How's the night going?" The boys slowed down, looking back at the man, who smiled warmly at them. He looked harmless enough, dressed in dark clothes, with a tired expression on his face, as though he had been out for a while. "It's going great," Johnny replied, still unsure about him. "We've been out for a while, getting lots of candy." "Well, that's good to hear," the man said, as he slowly pushed the stroller closer to them. "I was out with my daughter, but she's fallen asleep. If you boys want, I've got some extra candy I didn't get to pass out. It's all yours if you'd like it." The offer seemed harmless enough, almost kind, and Johnny's eyes lit up. "More candy? Yes, please." Sean, however, felt a small knot form in his stomach. It wasn't so much the candy, but the man's words that didn't sit right. "It's pretty late," Sean said cautiously. "Are you sure it's okay?" The man smiled again, his eyes squinting as if the smile was more of a practiced expression than one born of genuine cheerfulness. "Oh, of course. She's already asleep," he said, pointing to the stroller, which had a large cover draped over it. "You won't wake her. She's out cold." The sound of his voice, soft, almost like he was whispering to the stroller, was unsettling. But the promise of free candy, the fact that he seemed friendly enough, and the curiosity of what was under the cover pushed Sean and Johnny to follow. They walked alongside him as the man continued to make small talk, asking about their night, their costumes, and where they lived. His questions were innocent enough, but Sean couldn't shake the strange feeling growing inside him. The man didn't talk like any other parent he'd ever met. There was a stiffness to his words, a detachment that made Sean uneasy. And every time the man leaned in to speak to the stroller, his tone changed. It became unnervingly high-pitched, as if he were speaking to a child. But Sean couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When they arrived at the man's house, the unease in Sean's gut tightened. The house was dark, almost abandoned looking, with only a faint light flickering through a window. It didn't feel like the home of someone who had been out trick-or-treating with their child. The man led the boys up the walkway, his eyes still glancing back at them, and then he stopped in front of the door. He unlocked it slowly, almost methodically, as if it were taking too much effort. "Come on in," the man said, stepping inside and motioning for them to follow. "I'll get the candy for you." Johnny, eager for the promised sweets, moved forward without hesitation, his excitement outweighing the strange vibe he had picked up from the man. Sean hesitated for a moment, his feet frozen to the ground, but his curiosity got the best of him. He stepped inside, but as he did, the door creaked closed behind him with a heavy, almost final sound. The living room was dimly lit, and Sean glanced around, trying to distract himself from the growing sense of unease. The man was pushing the stroller to the center of the room, just a few feet away. He lowered the cover, and Sean watched in anticipation, unsure of what to expect. But when the cover came off, his heart stopped. The stroller wasn't holding a baby at all. There was no child, just a lifelike, grotesque doll, its eyes wide open, staring blankly ahead. The doll was positioned so carefully, so eerily, as if it were meant to be seen as real. The smooth, almost human-like face of the doll sent a chill down Sean's spine. He felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck, and his breath caught in his throat. Without thinking, Sean grabbed Johnny's arm and yanked him backward. "We need to go," he whispered, panic rising in his chest. But as they turned to leave, the door swung open, and a neighbor appeared in the doorway. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. "You two shouldn't be here," she said urgently. "You need to leave now. That man doesn't have a child. He's been doing this for years." Sean's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. The truth crashed down on him. The man was not a parent. He was a predator, using the illusion of a child to lure in unsuspecting victims. The doll in the stroller was just a decoy, a tool for his twisted plans. The woman led them to her car, and the boys rushed inside, their minds reeling. They didn't know what was worse, the realization of what had almost happened, or the fact that they had walked right into it, without even thinking. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. Sean's parents were furious, but also relieved that their son was safe. They forbade him from ever visiting that house again, and for years, the memory of that night stayed with him. As he grew older, Sean couldn't shake the images of that night, the lifelike doll in the stroller, the man's strange smile, and the overwhelming sense of danger. He had always thought Halloween was about fun and adventure, but after that night, he knew that some monsters didn't wear costumes. They wore the disguise of normalcy, and they could be lurking in places you least expect. Sean and Johnny remained friends, but that night changed them both forever. Halloween was never the same, and every year, when the leaves turned golden and the air grew crisp, Sean couldn't help but remember that night, the night when something truly horrifying almost happened, just steps away from the safety of home. Stoti 2. The Clown at the Door. Halloween night in 2016 had promised to be like any other for the young woman living alone in her quiet, secluded cul-de-sac. The kind of neighborhood where trick-or-treaters passed by without much thought, not really bothering to venture down the long, narrow streets that led to her house. Her home was a bit off the beaten path, tucked away from the usual hustle and bustle of the neighborhood Halloween festivities. Most years, she found herself left with bags of candy, untouched and forgotten, waiting to be stored away for the next year. She had become accustomed to the quiet, to the early departures of costume children, and to the feeling that Halloween wasn't really for her. This year, however, was different. For reasons she couldn't explain, the trick-or-treaters had been out in full force, and her doorstep had seen its fair share of visitors. As the evening wore on, she felt the usual tiredness settle in. The crowds had dwindled, and it was just past 9 p.m. when she thought the night had come to a close. Her dog, Tito, had quieted down after barking at every ring of the doorbell, and the porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the yard. She took a deep breath, feeling the weariness from a long evening, and thought to herself, "It's finally over." But then the doorbell rang again. It was strange. The trick-or-treating was supposed to have ended. The other houses on the block had long since turned off their porch lights, signaling the end of the festivities. Yet here was this late-night visitor, standing at her doorstep, at least an hour after the usual cut-off. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, it could just be someone else who had missed the usual crowd, a parent with young children hoping for just one more piece of candy. But as she approached the door, she felt an unsettling sensation creeping up her spine. On the other side of the door stood a man. He was tall, too tall, and dressed in a clown costume, with bright orange hair that seemed to glow unnaturally in the dim light of the porch. His face was painted with an exaggerated grin, the kind that looked more menacing than cheerful. The mask he wore was grotesque. The mouth stretched wide in a way that made her feel like he was sneering at her, even though he didn't speak. His eyes were dark, hollow, and lifeless. He stood there, swaying slightly, holding an almost empty sack that jingled with the sound of candy. "Got any more candy?" he asked, his voice thick with an odd, sing-song quality. Something about his tone felt off. There was a strange pause, as if he were waiting for her to say something specific. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding slightly faster than usual. Her first instinct was to shut the door and ignore him, but she didn't want to be rude, so she forced a smile, though it felt more strained than genuine. "We're all out," she said, trying to sound kind but firm. "Sorry, we don't have any more candy." She slammed the door shut, the metal frame rattling as it clicked into place. For a moment, the silence was almost comforting. She walked away from the door, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in her stomach. It was just a late trick-or-treater, nothing to worry about. But before she could settle back into the couch and resume watching her Halloween movie, she heard it. The doorbell rang again. Her stomach twisted. This time, her dog, Tito, started barking frantically from the hallway, his small body vibrating with agitation. He was a rat terrier, not known for being intimidating, but his barks were insistent and sharp. She stood there, frozen, listening to the incessant ring of the doorbell. "Just go away," she muttered under her breath, her heart pounding faster in her chest. But the clown didn't leave. A wave of fear swept over her, and she immediately pulled out her phone, sending a quick text to her family group chat. But as the seconds ticked by and her phone remained unanswered, the dread in her chest grew. Something wasn't right. Her instincts were screaming at her to stay away from the door, to lock herself inside. And then she heard it. A sound so unmistakable that it made her blood run cold. The storm door creaked. At first, she thought it was just the wind, maybe a draft pushing it slightly ajar. But then she heard the unmistakable snap of the latch being forced open. It wasn't the wind. Someone was trying to get in. Panic flooded her system. Her breath caught in her throat as she scrambled to grab Tito, clutching him tightly as she dashed upstairs. The heavy footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. The clown, or whoever he was still out there, lingering around her house. She locked herself in her bedroom, pressing her back to the door, her heart racing, mind whirling with thoughts of what he could want, what he could do. She checked her phone again. No messages, no calls. She felt completely isolated, cut off from the outside world. Suddenly, the loud knock came again. It wasn't just a knock at the door this time. It was a rhythmic pounding, as if he was trying to break the door down. She could hear his footsteps circling the house, moving from one window to the next, tapping the glass, testing the doors. The cold sweat that dripped down her back was the only thing that made her feel alive in that moment. Her phone was her only lifeline. She dialed 911 in a frantic hurry, her hands trembling so much she almost dropped the phone. The operator's calm voice did little to soothe her. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone at my house. A man in a clown costume, she managed to gasp out, the words barely forming. He's trying to break in. She could hear the operator's voice grow distant, repeating the usual questions. Address, details. Is the intruder still outside? The police would be here soon. But it felt like an eternity. Minutes dragged on. She heard the man circling again, this time the scrape of a ladder against the side of the house. Her stomach dropped. The man was climbing. Within seconds, she could hear him outside her second-floor window, his heavy breathing masked by the wind. The sound of his hands scraping against the window frame made her stomach churn. He was so close. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps faded into the night, and the house went eerily silent. Her phone buzzed. The police had arrived. When they searched the perimeter of the house, they found the broken latch on the storm door and a ladder leaning against the side of the house beneath her window. He had tried to climb up to her second floor. The officers told her they would be checking the area, but no one had seen him leave. To this day, she doesn't know what the man had intended. Was it just a sick prank? A twisted joke on Halloween night? Or had it been something far darker? Something far more sinister? She could never shake the feeling that she had narrowly escaped a far worse fate. The police didn't find the clown, and they couldn't identify him. He had disappeared into the night, just as silently as he had come. For weeks afterward, she couldn't walk through her house without feeling his presence lurking just outside, watching from the shadows. Halloween, once a time of fun and excitement, had turned into something much darker, a nightmare that she would never forget. Stoti 3, the house party that wasn't what it seemed. The night started like any other Halloween night for Kate and her friends. They were eager for an adventure, young, excited, and ready for a night of fun. Halloween was always a big deal in their circle. But this year, they wanted something different. They were no longer content with the usual house parties, the predictable costumes, and the same group of people. They wanted something new, something that would be talked about for years to come. So, when Kate's friend Shauna received a text from an acquaintance about a party happening at a house in a nearby town, the excitement was immediate. The message was clear. Huge party tonight, tons of people, come check it out. It was exactly what they were looking for. The idea of discovering a party where everyone they knew would be was enough to pull them into the night, unsure of what was really waiting for them. The house was just a short drive away, and they arrived just before 10 p.m., feeling the buzz of anticipation in the air. The cold October wind whipped through the trees, and the streets felt like they were wrapped in a festive blanket until they reached the house. It stood at the end of the street, isolated from the other homes, as if it were an island of mystery surrounded by darkened trees. The lights outside flickered a dull orange, and Halloween decorations hung lifelessly from the windows. The music wasn't blasting from inside, but there was an eerie, muffled bass that pulsed through the ground. There were no trick-or-treaters nearby, and the street felt strangely quiet for a Halloween night. The kind of quiet that made Kate's skin prickle with a slight unease. But that unease was fleeting, and her friends, laughing and joking, pushed it to the back of their minds. This was a party. This was going to be fun. The door was wide open when they arrived, as though they were expected. Inside, the house was dark and dimly lit with orange Halloween lights, but it had a weird, uninviting feel to it. The usual laughter and chatter you'd expect at a Halloween party were absent. Instead, there was a tense quietness that wrapped around the walls like cobwebs. The house looked like it had been hastily decorated for a party, but was devoid of warmth or welcoming energy. As they stepped inside, the first person they encountered was an older man who introduced himself as the father of the party's host. He had an uncomfortably warm greeting, almost too friendly, as if he had been waiting for them to arrive. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a broad smile that felt too wide, like it didn't quite reach his eyes. He immediately began talking about the drinks, asking them what they wanted and offering refills. But there was something about his demeanor that made Kate's stomach twist. At first, she chalked it up to him just being the overly friendly, overly involved father who was just there to make sure everyone was having a good time. But as he moved from one girl to the next, engaging in strange, overly personal conversations and lingering around them for too long, a discomfort began to settle in. He was constantly offering more shots, more drinks, leaning in too close, and making eye contact a bit too intensely. There was no sign of the host, no one else seemed to know who was in charge, and the energy in the house felt increasingly strange. Kate's friends had started to notice it too. At first, they tried to ignore the oddities, the way he hovered around them more than anyone else, how his laughter felt forced and uncomfortable. But it was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the night wore on, Kate felt herself becoming more and more disoriented. The music, the dim lighting, and the constant flow of alcohol clouded her thoughts. But something about the situation felt wrong, like the whole party was some sort of illusion. Her mind wasn't clear. The events started to blur together, and moments slipped through her fingers like water. She couldn't remember what she had said to some of the people in the house. She couldn't remember what had happened just moments before. It was as if the night was slipping away from her, and she couldn't hold on. She started to feel lightheaded and faint, but when she looked around, no one seemed to notice, no one seemed to care. The party continued on, but Kate's discomfort was growing. By the time her friends decided they wanted to leave, Kate had trouble even gathering her thoughts enough to agree. She had received a text on her phone, the first one from the father. He had sent a cryptic message. "Where are you, Kate? I thought we were going to talk. Come find me outside." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't given him her number, and certainly she didn't remember sharing it with anyone at the party. The oddness of the situation hit her like a punch to the gut. Her friends didn't seem as alarmed. They were just eager to leave, eager to go home. But Kate's mind was racing, piecing together the growing feeling of being watched, of being trapped. Why had the father been so insistent on offering drinks? Why had he been so focused on them? As they all headed out the door, Kate took one last look around the house, feeling the heavy weight of something dark hanging in the air. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had just narrowly escaped something far worse. But before they reached the car, Kate's phone buzzed again. The message was more disturbing than the last. "I see you. You can't just leave. I've been waiting for you. Come outside now." Kate's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. She turned to her friends, showing them the message. They were all confused, but the mood had shifted from light-hearted to tense. As they got into the car, Shauna looked up the number that had sent the message. The truth crashed down on them like a wave. The number wasn't associated with any name. It was a voice-over IP number, one that could be traced back to anywhere. It was fake. The father hadn't been the host. He had no reason to be contacting them, no reason to be involved with the party. They all looked at each other in horror. What had they walked into? The house, the strange man, the creepy texts. It was all too much. There had been no one at the party they recognized. The house had been dark and empty when they first arrived. No one seemed to know who the host was. And now, The unsettling truth: the house was vacant. Neighbors confirmed that no one had lived there for months. There was no record of any party, no indication that anyone was supposed to be there. Panic set in. The group decided to go straight to the police, explaining everything. They were shaken, unable to grasp the implications of what had just happened. When the police looked into the address, they found that there had been several complaints about the house. It wasn't just about the party. The man, posing as the host's father, had been luring young women into the house with promises of a fun time, of a party that never existed. The authorities had received reports of other girls being invited, but no one had thought much of it until now. Kate's heart sank as the police revealed more. The man had been using the party as a trap, an opportunity to lure young women into his home, to manipulate them, and to do God knows what with them. The idea that he had been preying on unsuspecting partygoers was terrifying. What if Kate hadn't listened to that uneasy feeling in her gut? What if they had stayed longer? What if they had gone outside to meet him? The police assured them they would investigate further, but Kate couldn't shake the dread that lingered in her chest. Even with the police involved, she couldn't help but feel like they had narrowly escaped something much darker. She couldn't help but wonder how many other girls had fallen victim to this man's twisted scheme. The more she thought about it, the more horrifying it became. The man had been using the promise of a party, a place to have fun, as a mask for something far more sinister. As they left the police station that night, the reality of what had almost happened hit her like a brick. The house, the man, the fake party. It had all been an illusion designed to trap them. And for Kate, that realization was even more terrifying than the dark corners of the house they had just fled. She couldn't forget what had happened, and every Halloween after that, the shadow of that night loomed over her. The terror wasn't just in the house. It was in the knowledge that someone out there was still using the same trick, still preying on the unsuspecting, and that the nightmare they had narrowly escaped was still lurking, waiting for someone else to fall into its trap. Conclusion. As we embrace the fun and excitement that comes with Halloween, the costumes, the candy, the festive atmosphere, we often forget that not all things that go bump in the night are part of the celebration. The 3 true stories we've shared are chilling reminders of how, even on a night filled with innocent fun, the real horror can come from the unexpected, from the things that hide in plain sight, disguised as something normal, something harmless. It's easy to forget that danger can lurk even in the most familiar of places, and sometimes the scariest thing we encounter is not a ghost or a ghoul, but a very real, very human threat. These stories are not just spine-chilling narratives designed to make us uneasy. They carry lessons that we must take to heart. They teach us that even in our most joyous and carefree moments, we must remain alert, aware of our surroundings, and listen to our instincts. Often, when we feel something is off, when we can't put our finger on it, but our gut tells us to be cautious, that is the time to trust ourselves. In the case of Sean, Johnny, Kate, and her friends, the moments of doubt and unease they felt were not paranoia. They were warnings. And those warnings, if ignored, could have led to devastating consequences. The real horror in these stories isn't just the predator lurking in the shadows or the sickening manipulation of trust. It's the realization that, in each of these moments, there were red flags that the characters failed to fully acknowledge at the time. Whether it was the man with the stroller who seemed too eager to give away candy, the clown who wouldn't leave the front door, or the man using a fake party to lure vulnerable young women into his home, all these predators counted on the victims ignoring their instincts, on the assumption that their Halloween fun would override their safety concerns. It is a harsh truth, but one we must face. Sometimes, the predators we need to watch out for are not the ones in scary costumes, but the ones hiding behind the mask of normality. who know how to blend in and lure us in. In a world that often celebrates the supernatural, witches, monsters, and creatures of the night, we forget that the most terrifying things are often the ones we don't see coming. This is not to say that we should abandon the fun or let fear consume us. Halloween is meant to be a time of joy, creativity, and excitement. It's an opportunity to embrace the thrill of the spooky and the unknown, and to celebrate in ways that allow us to step outside of our usual lives and enter a realm of fantasy. But as we don our costumes and wander through the night, it is equally important to remember that the world we live in isn't always as safe as we want it to be. Predators can appear in any form, and sometimes the scariest thing about Halloween is the real-world danger that lurks beneath the surface. The key takeaway from these stories is simple. Trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And don't hesitate to remove yourself from situations that make you uncomfortable, no matter how innocent they might seem at first. Your safety should always come first, no matter how enticing the candy or the party might appear. Trust that nagging feeling in the back of your mind, because it's there for a reason. Even if you can't fully explain it, it's your body's way of warning you about potential danger. In a larger sense, these stories remind us that we need to look out for each other. Whether it's a friend walking into a strange party or a neighbor who seems off, we must be vigilant and protective, not just of ourselves, but of those around us. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of the night and forget that we're not invincible, but we all have a responsibility to make sure that we, and those we care about, are safe. The impact of these stories could have been far worse if the characters didn't trust their instincts or didn't have someone looking out for them. We all play a part in keeping each other safe. In a world that can sometimes feel unpredictable and even dangerous, Halloween can serve as a reminder that we can have fun without compromising our safety. The true horror is not in the things we dress up as, but in the things we overlook. The subtle signs of danger, the whispers of our instincts that go ignored. It's easy to dismiss these feelings, to push them away in favor of the fun and excitement of the holiday. But these stories teach us that it's better to err on the side of caution, better to leave a party early or walk away from a stranger than to risk putting ourselves in harm's way. And we should always remember that safety is something that we control. We have the power to make choices that keep us protected, even when faced with pressure, excitement, or the fear of missing out. These terrifying true stories are a wake-up call. They remind us that the most dangerous things in life don't always wear masks. They wear the cloak of normalcy. The man in the stroller who offers candy, the friendly neighbor who lingers too long at the door, and the seemingly harmless party host, they all share one thing in common. They prey on our trust. But it's up to us to recognize the signs, to question the things that don't feel right, and to never let our guard down completely. This Halloween, as you venture out into the night, remember that the scariest monsters are not always the ones we can see. The true terror lies in the unseen dangers, those that take advantage of our kindness, our joy, and our willingness to trust. And while we should never live in fear, we must live in awareness. So go out, have fun, embrace the spirit of the season, but also stay vigilant. Be the one who listens to that gut feeling. Be the one who steps away when things don't seem right. And most importantly, be the one who reminds others that their safety always comes first, no matter how great the party or how tempting the candy. Because, at the end of the day, the most terrifying thing of all is not what we imagine lurking in the dark, but what we fail to see until it's too late.